On the night of November 18, 1995, a small crowd of steelworkers gathered on a catwalk above Furnace C at the Bethlehem Steel plant in Pennsylvania. They were not there to fight a fire. They were there to watch one die. For 140 years, molten iron had poured out of this plant day and night, through 2 world wars, through booms and strikes and floods. That night, the last of it drained out, cooled, and went solid. No one in that crowd needed to be told what it meant. This was the company that built the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, the Hoover Dam. At its peak, it employed more people than most American cities had residents, and it was, for a few key years, the second largest steel producer on Earth. So how does a company that built the skeleton of modern America end up watching its own fire go out on a Saturday night, with almost no one outside Pennsylvania paying attention? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what made Bethlehem Steel unbeatable, and why that same thing made it impossible to save. The story starts in 1857, in a small Pennsylvania town on the Lehigh River, when a group of local investors founded the Saucona Iron Company to roll wrought iron rails for the railroads racing across the country. 4 years later, they renamed it the Bethlehem Iron Company, and for decades, it stayed a solid, unremarkable regional supplier. The company that would eventually reshape American industry did not really begin until 1904, when a steel executive named Charles Schwab took control. Schwab had already run United States Steel, the largest corporation on the planet at the time, and he had left it convinced he could build something better and leaner from a smaller base. He folded Bethlehem's ironworks together with a shipyard in San Francisco and a handful of smaller firms into a single new corporation, and he brought in a young electrical engineer named Eugene Grace to run the day-to-day operations. Grace turned out to be one of the most effective industrial managers of the century. Where older steel companies were slow and bureaucratic, Schwab and Grace built Bethlehem to move fast, take on ambitious contracts other firms would not touch, and reinvest aggressively in new capacity. Within a decade, a company that had barely registered on the national steel market was competing directly with the giant that Schwab himself had once run. Schwab was not some outside financier taking a gamble. He had literally run the steel industry's biggest player and walked away from it, convinced he could do it better on his own terms. And that confidence became the founding culture of Bethlehem itself. Move first, build bigger, worry about paying for it later. In 1908, Bethlehem introduced a new way of rolling steel into wide, flat beams shaped like the letter H, strong enough to carry the weight of a skyscraper on a fraction of the steel older methods required. That single innovation reshaped the American skyline. Bethlehem Steel went into the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, the Waldorf Astoria, and dozens of bridges that are still carrying traffic today. The George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. It went into the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam. When the United States entered 2 world wars, Bethlehem became the arsenal. During the Second World War alone, the company produced more than 73 million tons of steel and built over 1,100 ships across 15 shipyards. At one Massachusetts shipyard, Bethlehem promised President Roosevelt it could deliver a new ship every single day. It beat that promise by 15 ships. By 1945, wartime sales had reached $1.33 billion, and the company employed roughly 300,000 people between its mills and its shipyards. Even after the war wound down, the company kept growing. By 1957, its best post-war year, Bethlehem produced over 19 million tons of steel, earned $190 million in profit on $2.6 billion in sales, and employed about 165,000 people. It was the 14th largest corporation in the United States, a fixture on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and its stock traded on the New York Stock Exchange under a ticker that needed no explanation. Just 2 letters, BS. Decades later, a historian summed up what that scale had actually meant for the country. He said Bethlehem was the company most important to America's national defense of any company in the past century, and that the nation would not have won either world war without it. For most of the 20th century, that was simply an accepted fact, not a debate. But while Bethlehem was busy being the biggest, The rest of the world was quietly building something better. After the Second World War, Japan and West Germany had to rebuild their steel industries almost completely from scratch, because so much of them had been bombed to rubble. Instead of repairing the old open hearth furnaces that companies like Bethlehem still relied on, they built brand new plants around two newer technologies: the basic oxygen furnace, which could turn raw iron into finished steel in under an hour instead of most of a day, and continuous casting, which shaped molten steel directly into usable slabs instead of pouring it into molds and reheating it later. Together, those two changes cut the cost and the time of making a ton of steel dramatically. Bethlehem was not blind to any of this. Its engineers understood the technology perfectly well. The problem was not knowledge. The problem was that Bethlehem already owned an enormous, functioning, only partly depreciated network of open hearth mills across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Indiana, built during exactly the decades when the company had been winning. Replacing them meant writing off assets that were still, on paper, valuable, and pouring new capital into plants that competed with the ones already running. Bethlehem did eventually build modern casters, but not until the 1980s at Burns Harbor and Sparrows Point, roughly a generation after its Japanese and German rivals had already rebuilt around the new technology from day one. There is a bitter irony buried in that delay. Bethlehem itself had been the disruptor once, the company that reinvented how steel was rolled in 1908 and forced everyone else to catch up. 50 years later, it was the incumbent standing still while somebody else did exactly what it had once done to the rest of the industry. Here is the part that makes Bethlehem's story different from a simple tale of foreign competition. The company was not just competing against newer overseas mills. It was also competing against a new kind of competitor at home: small American companies called minimills, led by a firm named Nucor, that melted scrap steel in electric furnaces instead of mining and smelting raw ore. Minimills were smaller, non-union, and dramatically cheaper to run, and they started eating away at the simple, high-volume products that had always been Bethlehem's bread and butter. So Bethlehem was being squeezed from both directions at once: efficient rebuilt giants overseas on one side, and lean, cheap upstarts at home on the other, while it was still carrying the enormous fixed costs of the very scale that had once made it unbeatable. Every blast furnace it had built, every shipyard, every union contract signed during the boom years, when profits were huge and workers had real bargaining power, all of it had to keep being paid for, whether the plant was competitive or not. This is the part most people get wrong about Bethlehem Steel. So if you want to see exactly how the math finally broke, stay with me, because it did not happen quickly. It happened over 3 decades, one deferred decision at a time. The very things that had made Bethlehem the biggest name in American steel, the size of its plants and the size of its workforce, were now the 2 things it could least afford to carry. None of it was a secret, and none of it was a single bad decision. It was hundreds of ordinary, defensible choices: keep the mill running 1 more year, honor the contract signed in the good times, made by people who had every reason at the time to believe the good times would keep paying for themselves. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the pressure kept building. Wage and price controls imposed by the Nixon administration in 1971 squeezed profit margins right when the company most needed capital to modernize. A flood on the Lehigh River in 1972 knocked out one of its own iron mines. By the early 1980s, Bethlehem was losing money on a scale that would have ended most companies outright, close to $2 billion over just a few years, and it briefly suspended major operations to stop the bleeding. Chairman Donald Trotline resigned in 1986 after presiding over the worst of those losses, and his successor, Walter Williams, delivered a short recovery in 1987 that gave everyone false hope: a profit of $174 million after the prior year's loss. But the recovery did not last. A recession in 1991 pushed the company back into the red and its plants down to roughly half capacity. Meanwhile, its retiree obligations, pensions, and health insurance promised to workers during the good decades kept compounding, reaching an unfunded liability of around $1.6 billion by 1993. Restructuring in the mid-1990s brought that number down for a few years, but by the late 1990s, a wave of cheap, imported steel, dumped into the American market during the Asian financial crisis, crushed prices across the entire industry at exactly the moment Bethlehem could least absorb another shock. Health insurance costs alone were running 2 to 3 times higher than at its rebuilt overseas competitors. Bethlehem's own stock quietly told the story. It had been a Dow Jones Industrial Average component for decades, and by 1997, it was removed from that index entirely, followed a few years later by removal from the S&P 500 as well. Two of the clearest signals Wall Street can send that a company no longer belongs among America's biggest players. The company that had once outbuilt everyone was now simply out of room to maneuver. The end came in stages, each one closing a door that had been open for over a century. In 1995, the blast furnaces in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania itself, the ones that gave the company its name, went cold for good, the scene we opened this video with. 2 years later, in 1997, the company shut down its shipbuilding division entirely, the same business that had once promised Roosevelt a ship a day. Then, on October 15, 2001, Bethlehem Steel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the 25th American steelmaker to do so in just 3 years. By then, the company had only about 11,500 active workers left, but it still carried pension and retirement obligations to roughly 95,000 retirees and their families, a ratio of almost 9 retirees for every worker still on the payroll. The stock that had traded under the ticker BS since 1906 was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange the following year, ending a run of nearly a century. In December 2002, the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation stepped in and formally took over Bethlehem's pension plan, absorbing about $7.2 billion in guaranteed benefits, of which roughly $3.7 billion was unfunded. It was, at the time, the largest pension takeover in the agency's history, both in dollar terms and in the number of people covered. In 2003, Bethlehem Steel Corporation was dissolved, and its remaining assets sold off to a company called International Steel Group. The name Bethlehem Steel and the 2-letter ticker BS simply stopped existing. What happened to the pieces afterward is its own strange coda. International Steel Group was bought out by Mittal Steel in 2005, which merged with the European giant Arcelor the following year to form ArcelorMittal, today the second largest steelmaker on Earth. Some of the old Bethlehem sites eventually passed again, in 2020, into the hands of an American company called Cleveland Cliffs. But the plant that once employed 31,000 people in a single valley never went back to making steel, and none of the corporate names that inherited its assets kept the name Bethlehem Steel alive even as a brand. Starting in 2007, the site of the old Bethlehem, Pennsylvania mill was redeveloped into an arts and entertainment district called Steel Stacks. Built literally in the shadow of the same blast furnace towers the company could not afford to replace. Today, there is a casino on part of that ground, along with concert stages and an arts center, and tourists walk past the preserved, rusting furnace stacks the way people once walked past ruins in Rome. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, the Golden Gate Bridge that Bethlehem Steel helped build in the 1930s is still carrying more than 100,000 vehicles across San Francisco Bay every single day, made of steel from a company that no longer exists to collect a single dollar for it. It is tempting to file Bethlehem Steel away as another casualty of cheaper foreign competition, but that misses the real lesson. Bethlehem did not fail because it stood still. It failed because the very scale that let it out billed every rival for half a century. The huge plants, the massive workforce, the generous contracts signed when money was easy, became the thing it could no longer afford to change. Being big enough to build the future, again and again, for decades, is not the same as staying light enough to keep rebuilding it. Sometimes, the exact strength that makes an empire unbeatable is the strength that finally makes it impossible to save. If you want to see how another American giant got trapped by its own success, there is a full playlist of stories just like this one on this channel. Subscribe if you want the next one, and let us know in the comments, did anyone in your family ever work in steel?